What does grindcore, laserdisc, and crotchety Lucio Fulci have in common? Stay tuned, because we're going to be talking about it in the Cinematic Void Podcast. Welcome to the Cinematic Void Podcast. Cinematic Void is a cult film series that primarily does screenings in Los Angeles at the American Cinematheque's Egyptian Theater in Hollywood, as well as the Aero Theater in Santa Monica. Our next screenings will be a co-presentation with our friends Friday Night Frights. We're doing Intruder on March 27th with director Scott Spiegel and actor Danny Hicks in person. Then on Saturday, March 28th, we'll be doing an off-site at the Montalban with Severin Films for their annual Super Shock pop-up film festival. You can find Cinematic Void on the World Wide Web at cinematicvoid.com, as well as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course Patreon, where we host this podcast. If you're not signed up for a Patreon, hey, why not? By pledging as little as $5 a month, you get early access to the podcast, exclusive content, digital downloads of our audio-visual mixes, and of course, the more money you put in, the more cool things you get, like merch and that kind of thing. I'm your host, Jim Branscombe, and to my right is...
Hey, I'm your co-host, Nick Vance. You can find me over at Paranoid Futures at Instagram, Letterboxd, Twitter, and all that good shit. Here we go.
So this is our first episode, we have a guest on. Our guest tonight is one of the pioneers of extreme music. I'm pretty sure he likes me saying that right now. But he's been in such bands as Repulsion, Cathedral, The Super Bees, Death Breath, and Septic Tank. He's also an avid cult film fanatic, and he's a friend of the Void. Please welcome Scott Carlson.
How you doing, guys?
Awesome. So, Scott, we're friends. We talk cult movies all the time. I figured it'd be appropriate that you be our first guest.
Thank you.
We're just going to jump right into it. So,
Damn glad to be here, as Inbred Jed would say.
Well, we did drive to your house, so we made it easy on you. Just so you know, we have tried Metallica whiskey, Motorhead whiskey, and what the hell's the other thing here? Angel's Envy whiskey. So we're on a whiskey flight right now, which makes podcasting so much better. So the thing I've kind of looked at, like people that start getting into like extreme music and extreme movies, it's like it becomes a set obsession at some point. At what point growing up did you, what was your first obsession? Was it music, was it movies, or was it a combination of both at the same time?
Probably a little bit of both, but I would say the more vivid memory for me is films. One being when I was maybe like 3, 2, I remember seeing the ad for Planet of the Apes on television, the original film, and also Clockwork Orange. I remember seeing the ads on television. Those two films, just the ads on television made me think. And then my dad also had an 8mm projector. And back in the late 60s, early 70s, you could go to like Kmart and go to the jewelry department. And they had a rack, like a spinning rack of 8mm film cut downs. And you could get, Bride of Frankenstein, lots of horror movies. There was a lot of horror stuff and old Felix the Cat cartoons and Mickey Mouse and things like that. And they had no sound because we didn't have a Super 8 projector. We just had an 8mm. So we would buy the little 5-minute reels, and we had like Bride of Frankenstein and stuff like that. And we would have movie night, make popcorn, put a sheet on the wall, break out the 8mm projector, and show these little film reels. And that sort of blew my mind. That was my first exposure to Frankenstein. And my dad, to this day, you could probably have my dad come down to Cinematic Void if you're ever showing Westerns. And you can turn a Western on for 5 seconds, and my dad will tell you every cast member, the plot. Doesn't matter if it's a spaghetti Western, American Western, Ford, Leone, whatever, you name it, my dad knows this shit inside and out. So I grew up, and he's also a monster movie, old monster movies. He grew up on that stuff, the matinees. My dad's 74, so he grew up in that era where you could go down to the movies for a nickel and see horror movies all day long. And so I grew up watching Frankenstein, all the Universal stuff, and that was sort of my first obsession, was Frankenstein.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And then, of course, my dad was also into music, so he played a lot of Beatles and Jimi Hendrix and The Who and the Stones and stuff like that in the house. So I was kind of getting music and films both at the same time.
Okay. Now, at what point did you decide that you wanted to start making music on your own?
It was probably like the early or late 70s. I got a guitar when I was about 12. I still have it. So I started playing guitar, and the kid across the street from me had a drum kit. So we were like jamming. Like as soon as I knew how to play 3 chords, I had a drummer who lived right across the street from me, who had like a cheap drum set from like a Spiegel department store catalog. And so we would jam in his basement. Like I had a little, guitar, and he had a drum kit. We were like making songs. Our band was called Savage Youth. Our songs were all instrumentals because we didn't have a microphone, so we couldn't do vocals or anything. But we did write songs. They were incredibly basic. But and then I was really I got into heavy metal, obviously, like Ted Nugent, Black Sabbath. All that Kiss, all that kind of stuff in the 70s. And then the first band where I was like, I think I could actually start my own band was when I heard Def Leppard on the radio. Their first record was called On Through the Night, came out in the spring, I believe, of 1980. And they were getting airplay. They had a song called Rock Brigade that was like the first single. It was getting played on the radio, and to me, they sounded like a teenage version of like Judas Priest. And I remember the DJ like mentioning that the drummer was like 16 or 17 years old, and that blew my mind. And I was like, man, these guys are like teenagers. Like, we should start a band. We could do if they can do a band, we can do a band. Like obviously when I started like writing my own songs, by that point where I got really proficient at it, I was into way more extreme music. But yeah, it was Def Leppard.
A funny thing about Def Leppard was they were, I guess they kind of got lumped in more of the, I don't want to say glam metal, but like that stuff later on, but like they were closer to new wave of British heavy metal at the time, right?
Yeah, for sure. Like when their first record came out, they were definitely part of the new wave of British heavy metal, even though I don't think all those bands were like, hey, we're all the same scene or whatever. There were just happened to be bands popping up all over the country in the UK that were, partly influenced by the punk scene where people were making their own records and starting record labels and everything. That sort of rubbed off on Heshers, and they started putting bands together and going, hey, we can put our own records out and go down and play at the pub just like the punk bands. And a lot of times they were crossing over. Iron Maiden used to play with the Cockney Rejects at local pubs, and I think they bought their first PA from a punk band. I can't remember the name of the band right now. I don't think it was the Rejects, but they bought their first PA from friends of theirs that were in a well-known English punk band. I wish I could remember it right now, but I don't think it was the Rejects, but it was something along those lines. So yeah, I mean, they were part of that scene for sure.
Now, when you started writing music, and I know this because I'm just basing this more on the Repulsion material, were you consciously pulling inspiration from films and things you were watching, or was it just something natural that came up as a subject matter?
For lyrics, yeah. I mean, I was really into all the extreme metal bands at the time. Iron Maiden was probably one of the first bands that I can remember that were writing songs specifically about literary works and films and TV shows. They had The Prisoner, and they had Murders in the Rue Morgue, and they had several songs that were written about films and whatnot. And so that sort of like opened the door for that. And then, of course, I was into zombie movies and shit like that at the time, so it just seemed really natural we wanted our lyrics to be extreme. Slayer was already around, and Metallica, and so we were always thinking like we want to be more than what that is. Like we weren't trying to be better than Slayer or Metallica, but we wanted to be more extreme. If Metallica was fast, we were like, we want to be faster than that. Slayer was heavy and evil. We got to be more evil than that. Dawn of the Dead was pretty fresh in my mind, and Zombie and Gates of Hell and all that shit. So it just seemed natural to write about it.
Was there anything much more extreme than, say, Slayer or Metallica at the time that you guys were closer to?
Slaughter from Toronto, and some Discharge. Some of the punk bands we were listening to. Hellhammer Like right when we started up, Hellhammer was around, and of course Possessed came along, who kind of took the Slayer formula and made it a little more nasty, and they weren't as fast as Slayer. At that time, Slayer just annihilated pretty much if you talk to anybody that was into punk or metal in like 83, 84, 85, they're going to tell you like Slayer was just wiped the floor with everyone. There were other bands that were more extreme in certain ways, but certainly nothing as devastating as Slayer. So, it was like, we know we can't be that powerful, but let's try and be faster than them. Let's try and be like noisier. If we heard a band that had distorted bass, it was like, well, let's turn the distortion up a little bit more. Oh, that band's fast, but let's play faster. That sort of thing. And it was like, oh, they wrote some really disgusting lyrics. Like, okay, we're going to fucking write some even more disgusting lyrics, So that was sort of the mentality, was like, we were dealing in extremes because we weren't the greatest band in the world. We weren't the most technically proficient band, although Matt, the guitar player, is still to this day one of my all-time favorite guitar players. He's an incredible guitar player. But, we were just... we were dealing in extremes, and like using what talent we had. We weren't as brilliant as Slayer. We could tap into what they were doing, from an extremity level and see that like the meter hadn't reached the max yet,
Now, when Repulsion was like kind of born, it was originally Tempter, right? That was the first name, and you changed what was it, Ultraviolence and then Genocide at that point, right?
Yeah.
Was it just trying to figure out like a name to reflect the sound?
Yeah, and also something that looks... honestly, a band name for me is like, does it look cool on paper? Is it going to look great on the back of somebody's jacket? Does it look good on a shirt or an album cover or whatever? How does it sound? How does it roll off the tongue? And Tempter was like, my first lazy attempt at a band name. I took it from the Trouble song. The Tempter from their first album. Same thing with when we finally settled on Repulsion. I had a book that I found at the library that had it was like a horror encyclopedia or something, and it had a picture of Catherine Deneuve in the scene where she's going down the hallway with all the arms and everything, and that stuck in my mind. And then so I wrote a song called Repulsion. I'd never seen the film, 'cause, we're talking like 85 or so, and like. I know that Repulsion was probably on VHS at that time, maybe not, but you couldn't just go out and see any movie you wanted to like you can now. So I was like, man, I really would love to see that movie. And you build it up in your mind like what it is, and like it's sometimes your imagination is way greater than what the film actually is. In that case, actually Repulsion is a great movie, but I just liked the way the word looked in the book. It just popped out at me. And I looked it up in the dictionary, and I was like, fucking, that's cool right there. So I wrote a song called Repulsion, and the lyrics had nothing to do with the film. They were more about the word and what it means, just being repulsive. And like, it's just doesn't even make any sense. The lyrics are it's just me stringing together a bunch of really offensive things like fornicating zombies and rabid dogs ripping apart a corpse and a baby, fetus in the garbage with a hanger stuck through its head and shit like that. It's just a bunch of like really offensive shit, which it's funny now, but at the time it was like, I was sort of in like a rap battle with Chuck Schuldiner of Death, a friendly one where we would call each other on the phone and be like, dude, listen to this. I just wrote this, and then I'd be like, oh yeah, well listen to this, and so we would kind of bounce ideas off each other and like try and gross each other out with our lyrics and shit.
Now, this is primarily a film podcast, but we talk a lot about music. A lot of people who listen aren't really aware that in the 80s, like during the metal and punk scene, there was a big tape trading like thing. You want to talk about that? Because that was a way for bands to get, discovered worldwide. I mean, not discovered in the sense of like being huge, but discovered on a global level by just tape trading.
Well, if you were involved in that scene, it was like worldwide, and it did seem like you'd made it big, because we all knew that Metallica were discovered by people trading their tapes around. All these bands, they had the benefit of being on the West Coast, so they had people like Brian Slagle from Metal Blade, who was like young, motivated guy who wasn't in a band, but he was like, I'm starting a fucking record label, and listen to that band, and he went around L.A. and like plucked up all these, everything from like Rat to fucking Metallica and Slayer. He was signing up all these bands. It was all metal. And back then, people weren't so like, oh, fucking fuck you, you like Rat, whatever, It was more just like, this is all metal, right? And we're all just happy that there's like fucking bands playing heavy music. And Brian Slagle was signing these bands up. But if you weren't in LA, you had to like get your music to him somehow, or people like him, and it was like, make a demo. And there just happened to be, it was, obviously it spun off from the whole DIY thing that came from punk and new wave of British heavy metal, where people were making records, and then it was like, well, we can't afford to make a record, so let's make a cassette. And people just started passing the cassettes around, and next thing you know, there was this network of people all over the world that were advertising their, putting want ads, classified ads in the back of all the magazines, mainstream down to fanzines, like Tape Traders, putting together tape lists and stuff like that. And like, I would get these lists, and I would look, and if I saw somebody that had like good taste, I wouldn't just send it to the magazine. I would go through the want ads. And if I saw some guy that was going like, I'm into fucking Hellhammer and this and that, Bathory, whatever, I'd go, I'm going to fucking send that guy a tape. And I would just unsolicited send him a copy of our tape and be like, here, this is my band. Share this with as many people as you can. And that was basically how we got the word out. We were very, I was very proactive in pushing our music out to tape traders. More so than just like sending it to fanzines or trying to sell our demos at shows. It was like, I targeted tape traders that I knew were influential people, and I sent them our tape for free, unsolicited, and said, please send this to his, put this on your tape list and share it.
It's actually pretty fucking smart, especially like, because this is pre-social media. Like, that's the only way like you can get your band out there.
It was social media. Yeah. It just wasn't as as easy as it is now. But it was the same sort of thing. In fact, there were certain guys that had, there was a guy that lived in California. His dad, his name was Bill, and he was in a band called Decapitator or Decapitated or something like that. I think his dad worked for the phone company or something like that. And he had these phone hacks where he could do like a party line and call up like 20, 30 people. And he would have like 30 people on the phone. It would be like Caton from Hyrax and Jeff Becerra from Possessed and Tom Warrior and the dudes from Slaughter and the fucking guys from all over the fucking country that were in bands. Like, we'd be on there, Chuck Schuldiner would be on there. And everyone would just be talking over each other, like talking about their bands, and everyone was kissing each other's ass. Oh, dude, you're God. No, you're God. Like that kind of shit, And it was amazing. And back then, and you like run up your dad's phone bill. But yeah, that was social media back then.
I mean, that's much better than running it up with a 900 number back then.
Yeah.
So with the tape trading stuff, is that how you met Chuck, and is that how you got involved with Death and moving to Florida and all that stuff? Is that how that went down?
There was a fanzine called Guillotine from Florida, and I went into my local record store, and there was a copy of the Guillotine zine sitting there on the counter, and I bought it, took it home and reading it, and there was like an article about Mantis in there. So I sent Chuck, I was reading it, and I'm like, man, these guys, like, their influences sound like really similar to ours, So I sent Chuck a tape, like I did to everybody, and he sent me back a tape, and I listened to it, and I'm like, fuck yeah, this is like very similar to what we were doing in Genocide. Chuck had put his phone number in there, so I called him, and we started talking on the phone, like, hey man, like, yeah, I don't really have a band right now, I just got this drummer. And they had a guitar player, Rick Ross, at the time, who was later in Massacre and whatnot. So there was three of them. And
was it Chuck, Rick, and Cam Lee?
It was Chuck, Rick, and Cam. And so like I told my friend Sean, who played bass in Genocide, I'm like, you should go play bass for these guys. They need a bass player. my good friend, is selling all of his things to move down to Florida to play in Death. And then in the meantime, Rick Ross quits. So Chuck calls me and he's like, Rick's out. Like, now I need a guitar player and a bass player. And I'm like, fuck. I already told Sean, like, to sell all of his stuff and move down there and play with you. But now it seems like it makes more sense that me and Matt come down and play with you, because I play bass and he plays guitar, and it just makes more sense. So, like, I had to go be the one to break to my friend Sean, like, hey, you're not going to Florida, dude. Like, we're going. And he'd already told all of his friends. Everyone was like, fuck yeah. I mean, it was awful. It was really, really shitty. To be fair, Sean and I are still friends nowadays, but at the time it was pretty bad.
Now, when you moved down to Florida with Matt and you were jamming with like Chuck and Cam, were you just doing strictly Death material, or were you also incorporating Repulsion Genocide material in that as well?
We were doing some of our material as well, yeah. But it was weird. We got down there and Cam quit almost immediately, which was like, it's a bunch of dumbass 18-year-old kids, you know what I mean? Everyone was, young and stupid. So Cam didn't really think it through, like, oh, these guys are like packing up their entire lives and moving down here. Maybe I should make a commitment. He was just like, I don't want to play drums anymore. I want to be a singer. And we were like, well, we have like 3 fucking singers, not really singers, but, death metal vocalists in this band. Like, you're one of them. Like, just play the drums and fucking sing. You can do your songs. I'll do mine. Chuck does his. But he didn't see it that way. I think it was probably more, him and Chuck just didn't see eye to eye. Didn't want to play with him anymore. So we tried all summer, like, looking for a drummer, which was hilarious, in Orlando in 1985. Trying to find Orlando was like, at the time, like, probably the most culturally devoid major city in Florida, for sure, possibly in the country. I don't know. There was nothing to do there. There were a couple cool record stores, but the only thing there was to do down there was the drive-in. And every weeknights, Friday, Saturday, anytime we would buy a case of beer and go to the drive-in. And that summer we saw Life Force and Deadly Spawn on a double bill. Like, I'm not kidding, we probably saw it 12 times each film. But twice every night, So like we probably saw both films 24 times over the course of the couple of weeks that it was playing there, because we went there almost every night to the drive-in. And then later we did the same thing, sadly, with the third Road Warrior movie, which
Beyond
was
Thunder,
really bad. I don't remember what played with that one. Totally unmemorable, but
it wasn't another post-nuke, was it? Or was it just?
I don't recall it all, but I remember the Deadly Spawn because I'd never heard of it, and it was like the backup feature to Life Force, and I was just like, "Holy fuck, what is this movie?" We were totally blown away by the Deadly Spawn.
I'm writing this now because, like, occasionally I'll look at old theater marquees, like a lot of the 42nd Street ones, and just see the fucked up, weird double features or triple features they used to do. Mm-hmm. My favorite one will always be Boys in the Hood and Naked Gun 2.
That's great.
Why that was programmed that way, I don't know, but obviously they're a bigger genius than I will ever be when it comes to that.
So yeah, we were playing everybody's material, but and then it just didn't work out. Matt and I started writing Repulsion songs in Florida because we were, we kind of thought that Chuck had the same idea we had, which was like, we want to be fucking extreme as fuck. And it turns out when we got to be better friends with him that, and this is not a knock on him, it was just what he wanted to do. Like he wanted to be more technical. You've all heard the Death records and see what trajectory they took from Scream Bloody Gore or even from the demos to what they became. He went way more prog, technical, tech death, whatever you want to call it. And my idea was to deconstruct music, as much as possible. I wanted to be extreme. I wanted to be able to make an entire song that had 2 chords in it or whatever. I wanted music that was like just completely primitive. And that was completely against what Chuck wanted to do. So when we wrote some of our early songs, 6 Feet Under, Lurking Fear, the riffs they're like 2-note riffs. That was what we wanted to do, and he didn't want to do that, so it didn't last very long, that whole experiment.
So that's why you and Matt moved back to Michigan and basically reformed Genocide, later Repulsion again. Is that when you found Dave Grave?
Yeah, we walked into the local record store in Flint, which is Wyatt Earp Records, and he had this door in the store. There was it was the record store on one side and a cleaners on the other, and there was a door that went between the two buildings, and on his side of the door, he kind of made it into like a bulletin board. There was a headline or like an article out of the newspaper that he had tacked up there that said local youth. If you look on the inside of the Repulsion album, you'll see it. It says like local youths arrested for skull robbery or grave robbery or something like that. We were in the store and we're like, yeah, man, we need to find a drummer. And he was like, why don't you get Bonehead? And we're all like, who's Bonehead? And he's like, Dave Hollingshead he was in this band called Bloody Coup at the time. He's like, Bloody Coup's drummer, man. He just got busted for grave robbing. And we were like, we looked at the article, we're like, that's our fucking guy right there, man. Let's fucking get a hold of this guy. So we were like, we honestly fucking found Dave Grave on the premise that he was a grave robber, and we were like, let's get a fucking grave robber in the band,
Now with Dave, you were able to push the extreme even more, especially in the drumming, because I know you've talked about it in Choosing Death and the History of Grindcore documentary about the cheat beat, because basically it's the discharge beat, but you cheat at it. You want to kind of explain what that is?
Well, it's more like the Slayer beat. We use 2 beats in Repulsion, 1 or 3 actually. One is the discharge beat, the D beat, and then we use the Slayer beat, which is more like a polka, just 1-2. That's the deep beat that all American death metal bands use, right? Boom, 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 boom.
I've never heard it as a polka beat.
It is I'm sorry I ruined it for you, but it is a polka beat.
But so Weird Al is the greatest death metal band ever.
You ruined the entirety of death metal.
And then there's the blast beat, right? Which we called sort of the cheat beat. And the reason being that it has one less, you're not playing the ride or you're not playing the cymbals on every beat. You're skipping a beat. So you're doing it on the 1 or the 3 instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, which you do on most drummers play the hi-hat or cymbal on every beat. So it's or sometimes even doubling it. But with a polka type beat like Slayer, like Dave Lombardo, he was playing it on every beat, so it's skipping a beat, and so we called it the cheat beat because Dave he wasn't familiar with that style, so he was trying to do what he could. He was trying to learn it while at the same time we were trying to be the fastest band in the world, so we were pushing him faster than he was able to perfect that. Later on, he got to be really fucking good at the Dave Lombardo beat and play it lightning speed, but at that time he couldn't do it, so he was cheating. We just called just cheat. And then next thing you know, we were just writing songs, and I said, well, how does this one go? And I'm like, well, the main chorus uses the cheat beat. So that's how that came about.
Now, something you've told me a few times, and when you set out to record the Stench of Burning Death record, which later became Horrified, you told me that you were looking to create the musical equivalent of Reanimator.
Yeah.
So do you want to kind of elaborate on that?
Well, the Reanimator came out in, I want to say, autumn of 85.
Yeah.
And we recorded that album in the spring or so of 86. So Reanimator was fresh in our minds. The first time we saw Reanimator, a whole carload of my friends and I went to see that film, and we dropped a hit of LSD each in the car on the way to the theater. So when we got to the theater, which was a 20-minute drive or so, it was the theater that it was playing at was out in the suburbs for some reason. I don't know why, but we got there and Dave Grave was already there. And when we walked in, the opening credits were on. So we'd obviously missed the opening scene with Dr. Gruber at the Miskatonic Hospital. And so he was like, you missed it, you guys missed it. We're like, oh, what did we miss? Like, the fucking credits are on, and did we already miss something? What the fuck? So, anyway, we sat there peeking on fucking acid watching that movie, and like, it just completely blew my mind. The ending of that film, you know, when it sort of ramps up, and there was nothing else like it at the time. I mean, like, Dawn of the Dead at the end, it doesn't go, like, they don't just put the pedal to the metal. Yeah. I'd never seen a horror film at that point that at the very end, like, you know, even Evil Dead is like, you know, it comes in spurts, and then and the ending isn't like just this non-stop marathon of fucking insanity. Reanimator was the first film that I can recall where it was just like all systems go. It was like, you know, when you're listening to like a Slayer song, like Haunting the Chapel, and at the end they go into the fast part, or the song Raining Blood. Yeah. At the end of the song, it goes fast and it just never stops. And it's like they just fucking turned everything up to 11. They just fucking plugged everything in. All the lights come on, fucking nonstop, just chaos.
Was that your first experience with H.P. Lovecraft? Like, I know you have songs like Lurking Fear, so was that already
No. The reason that I wanted to see Reanimator so badly when it came out was because I was a Lovecraft reader. I got into Lovecraft through comic books. Okay. Because like Bernie Wrightson had done some Lovecraft adaptations in like creepy and eerie, and they got reprinted in these comic books that came out in the early 80s called Twisted Tales. They were published by this company called Pacific Comics, and they did Twisted Tales, and they also did a series called Bernie Wrightson Master of the Macabre that was like, all of this shit was reprints from like eerie and creepy and stuff. I was totally into those. So one day at Kmart or something, I found a paperback that was like a compilation of Lovecraft stories, and I bought it, and I just read it from cover to cover. I was totally obsessed with it, and then I went and found the rest of the books in that series. They were the ones with the Michael Whelan art on the cover that ended up becoming like the cover of like 4 death metal records. Mm-hmm. That was my introduction to Lovecraft, was horror comics into the books. And then when I read in Fangoria that there was this horror film coming out that was based on Herbert West Reanimator, which was a story I could not find because it wasn't in any of those paperbacks. Yeah. I could not find that story, so I was like, fuck, this is incredible, you know? And I was so excited about Reanimator that we were like, let's do fucking acid and go see it. So yeah, we went to see it, and we were so freaked out by that movie that we were like, we got to go back and see it tomorrow because I'm not sure did that really happen? You know, did somebody get choked to death by fucking reanimated intestines and you know, like all of that shit that happened at the end of the movie? I was just like, so yeah, later on, it just sort of like struck me like, I want to do music that's like that. It's like so chaotic that it's just swirling around your head and so insane that you can't grab a hold of it. You can't fucking dance to it. You can't latch onto it. You know, it was like people would try to, you know, we used to play with punk bands, and the punk bands would come out and like a lot of them couldn't play. Most of them couldn't fucking play. And they're out there like playing their, you know, like, you know, fucking Fuck the President song or whatever. And it's like fucking, you know, people are moshing around like to the beat, and we would come out and play, and we're like, fucking mosh to this, motherfucker. You know, and like the beat was like, you couldn't mosh to it. All you could do is just these, you know, punk guys are just like standing there like looking at us like, what the fuck is going on? Metalheads weren't even, at least punk people would give us the time of day. You know, they were musically curious enough to like check it out and be like, oh, these guys are out of their fucking minds. Whereas like metal people just didn't even, you know, they needed to be sort of spoon-fed back then, you know. Mm-hmm. I will say, you know, like punk was way kinder to Repulsion than the metal scene was, because people are just way more curious in that scene than metalheads, you know. they needed to be like, okay, Slayer's pretty crazy. We need a little time before we move on to the next thing, you know. And metalheads or the punk people were just like, fucking bring it on, you know. So we made them laugh at least, you know. Where metalheads were just like, what the fuck is going on? So yeah, we developed quite a kinship with a lot of hardcore bands, and you know, I loved a lot of hardcore. I didn't mean to make light of it. It's like just a lot of the bands that we were playing with were like, you know, basement bands who fucking really couldn't play, and they were, you know, just having fun. A lot of them were like, you know, people in Flint were like, a lot of the punk bands were like guys who had real jobs and shit, you know. So there weren't a lot of the punks were either you were either really young or you had gotten a little bit older and you were like, fucking I need to go work at Buick. You know, so there was a lot of people like that worked at Buick that were in punk bands and shit. Okay. So yeah.
Do you think that's why when like after because you released the tape as like, because it was supposed to be an out, but then it's Stench of Burning Death and it was being your third demo. Mm-hmm. But when you sent it out, like, do you think that's why like there was such a connection with like the early earache bands like Napalm Death and Carcass and things, because they were more punk centric?
Well, I mean, there's a couple things. The tape trading thing is how the music got to those people. But when we were sending it to labels, no one gave a fuck. We sent it to Metal Blade and Combat and all the labels that we could think of. The funny thing is, I owned The Accused, Martha Splatterhead, the Earache, which was like the first full length they put up. I also had the Heresy flexi disc at the time. I just didn't think of that label as like, they didn't seem like, to me, because their version of Martha Splatterhead was a reissue, right? Mm-hmm. That came out originally on the band's own label or something out of Seattle. And the Heresy Flexi was a fucking flexi disc, so I didn't see Earache as like a real label at the time. So I didn't think to send it to them. They just weren't on my radar. It was interesting to me when it finally came around to like putting the album on, like, oh, the whole time, the one label that I owned records that I didn't send them a tape was this Earache label, and here they are, the ones that actually want to put it out.
Now, it didn't end up coming out on Earache when it was pressed on vinyl. It came out through Jeff Walker and Bill Steer of Carcass's like kind of sub-label of Earache at the time. Was it Necropolis or Necrosis? And like, how did they contact you about wanting to put out the last record?
I think what was happening was, you know, Napalm Death and you know, obviously Carcass sort of had Bill Steer from Napalm Death in the band. These bands were citing us as an influence. You know, the first Napalm Death record, I sort of freaked out when I first saw it because there's like, I was working at a record shop. We got a box of imports in, and the kid that I was working with was like, hey, check this out, Napalm Death. Let's listen to this. And we play it, and I think it's beginning of side 2 maybe, where it's got the opening riff from Stench of Burning Death.
Yeah.
And he flipped the record over, and maybe he played that side first. I don't remember. I just remember hearing that riff, and it didn't dawn on me that they had like completely pilfered it from us. I was thinking to myself, like, man, am I really that generic of a songwriter? Like, this band like came up with this same exact riff. Like, that's really weird. It's like exact, and it just wasn't it's just too weird. You don't think when you're like, you were in a band that lasted for 6 months, and you fall apart, and you just think, wow, that was a failure. You don't think like some other band that has a record out is like fucking lifting your ideas and fucking putting them on record, like blatantly, not trying to hide it. When I heard it, I find that when it dawned on me was when it goes into the next riff, and it was like, wait a minute, this is too much. Now they're playing the fucking Stench of Burning Death. So I run over and I grab the sleeve and I start looking at it, and I see like homemade Repulsion hats and shirts and everything, and I'm looking through the thanks list, and it's like Repulsion's mentioned multiple times in the thanks list, and then there's actually a picture of me on the collage on the inner sleeve that they must have gotten from like a tape trader or something. It's a photo of me, like, I know when it was taken, this kid who had a fanzine in Saginaw, Michigan, like I was taking the piss in the restroom at Harpo's in Detroit at a Megadeth show, and the kid was like, "Hey, turn around!" And like I went like this, and he snapped my photo, and they cut my head out and put it on the fucking on the collage on the inner sleeve. So yeah, it was just completely mind blowing that this band was, you know, citing us as an influence. So that's how all that stuff. That's how we ended up on Earache. Anyway.
Did you ever ask him about stealing that riff?
No, because I mean, we've never really talked about it. Maybe they've brought it up. I mean, I will admit the first many times that I hung out with Napalm Death, we were shit hammered, all of us, all the time, because back then even Barney was, you know, drinking. Like we were all completely annihilated every time, and so yeah, there were that probably did come up at some point, but we were never like, "Hey, you stole our riff." We were more like, "Thank you for stealing our riff because you fucking put us on the map." You know, I mean, they really, without Napalm Death, you know, we would be nowhere. Or and Carcass, you know, these bands, like I've said this before, but anything that they borrowed from us, they paid it back with, you know, full interest.
What was the reception when the Horrified got a proper vinyl release?
It was good, you know. It sold out. I mean, there aren't any surplus copies of it laying around. I don't know how many copies Earache sold, but it sold well. They released it on vinyl and CD, and it was kind of you know, pretty all over the place at the time. You could find it in stores. Earache had good distro, so it was readily available all over the place. And I believe they sold quite a few copies. And well, for one thing, in Terrorizer magazine, which at the time was the biggest, you know, metal magazine in the UK, besides maybe Kerrang. They gave us an 11 out of 10, which was the only time I believe they've ever done that. So the reception was great.
Now, every time like you got a re-release, because in the late 80s, early 90s, you reformed Repulsion, because you had broken up when the demo had, pretty close when the demo came, but you reformed in the 90s, then you reformed again in the, I guess, early 2000s, Relapse put it out. And you're currently still going, and because Nick and I are from the Baltimore, D.C. area, you ended up recruiting one of our friends, Chris Moore, who was in Magruder Grind. How did you end up getting Chris to play drums for you in Repulsion?
Well, yeah, when Chris joined, or right before Chris joined, we were just about to fold it up because Cole Jones, who was in Exhumed and a bunch of other bands, he was our drummer at the time, and his wife was pregnant, and he had just bought a home, and he was kind of like, you know what, man, I'm kind of done with the whole touring band thing. And Matt and I were always of the belief that when Cole was done, we were done, you know, because he's sort of like, if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have been able to carry on. We, you know, the original drummer, Dave Grave, and Aaron, the original guitar player, the other guitar player from the band, I should say, they still live in Michigan. And Matt and I live out here. Made it very difficult to play together. And we did one show at a early Maryland Death Fest, like maybe the second or third one. And it just didn't go well. We weren't well rehearsed, and all the other bands there were fucking on fire. And we just kind of we thought we got our asses handed to us. And after the show, I was sitting somewhere drinking a beer with Matt Harvey from Exhumed. And he was like, well, at least I can say I saw Repulsion. And that just like cut through me like a fucking knife, you know. I was like, man, that's the one thing I never want to fucking hear anybody say about my band, you know. I was like, well, at least I can say I saw them. Because I've seen many bands where I'm like, meh. At least I can say I saw them. You know, they weren't great, but I saw them, you know. Bucket list thing, whatever. So yeah, I was like, that's not good enough. We should have fucking kicked his ass, you know? So I kind of called it a day right then. I'm like, you know what? You guys live in Michigan. We live in California. This is just not going to work out. We can't play anymore. It just doesn't make sense. But then a couple years later, maybe a year later or something, when Relapse put out the reissue CD, they asked us if they could, I think it was Rich Hoke from Brutal Truth was the booking agent at the time. He was like, what do you guys think if I just put you on the booking roster? Because they used to do like in-house booking back then. And we were like, Sure, why not? No one's going to fucking call you, but go ahead, put us on there. And next thing you know, it was like a Maryland Death Fest and fucking the one that used to be up in Milwaukee.
Milwaukee Death Fest.
We did both of those. And I think Maryland was after Milwaukee. It was because that was when we were like, this just doesn't, the logistics don't work out when we don't have time to rehearse or whatever. So we called it a day. But then offers started coming in from Europe. And it was like, wow, we kind of have to play Europe. That was our, that's where all of our fans came from. We had plenty in the States, but it was like, it seemed like more Europeans sort of like took to Repulsion more than Americans did back at the time when in the tape trading days. So we were like, we have to go play these European shows. And Dave and Aaron were like, I don't know. It's like, it's the logistics just did not work out. They weren't going to. So when we met, I think Matt went up to the Bay Area and met Cole and was like, I know this dude up in the Bay Area that could play drums for us. We got him and worked out great for years. But then when he left, we were going to fold the whole band up, and he was like, no, I know this guy named Chris Moore. Bring him in. He'll fucking nail it. And of course, Cole was right. Chris is the man. That was a very roundabout way of getting to that.
No, I think it's a good way of saying it because Chris was like probably significantly younger than us because like we were like probably post-college when like McGrew Grind started. So he was like really young, but it's just like that dude's a fucking great drummer, and like he would just pop up in other bands. And when we heard like, hey, he's playing for Repulsion, it's just like that's the dude that belongs there because like he lives, breathes that shit. So I was just always kind of curious how he ended up there, but like Chris is a good dude.
He was a recommendation.
Awesome. Now I want to switch from Repulsion for a bit and talk about in the 90s you ended up being a live member in Cathedral for a bit, and then back in the kind of later 2000s you ended up being a permanent member. How'd you end up in Cathedral?
Well, I was actually a permanent member both times. The first time, a friend of mine from Detroit, Sean Gazinski, was bugging me about this ad that Cathedral were running in, and I was a huge Cathedral fan. From the moment I heard Forest of Equilibrium, I was completely blown away by Cathedral. They were like pretty much my favorite band in the early 90s. Definitely my favorite heavy band. And they were looking for a bass player. They were signed to Columbia in that totally unlikely deal that happened where Fudge Tunnel and Godflesh and Napalm Death and Carcass and Cathedral and Entombed were all on Columbia Records.
So I'm just going to give a little context for people that aren't up on like their metal like we are. So in the 90s, basically record labels were looking for the next Metallica in a way. So when Earache, when Napalm Death was really big, it was like number 2 in the indie charts in England and stuff like that. Columbia was like, maybe we should sign some of these death metal records because we think that one of these could be the next Metallica. So they signed like Napalm Death, Godflesh, Carcass, Fudge Tunnel, Entombed, and I think Morbid Angel had their own deal with Giant at the time.
Morbid Angel had their own deal.
And Cathedral was one of those bands. I think Cathedral was the first one that actually...
Cathedral was signed directly to Columbia. Yeah, a lot of the other bands were deals through... I think Carcass and Cathedral were the only two that were actually signed to Columbia. The rest were like licensed. But yeah, I think also Columbia looked at Earache as like a sub pop of metal.
Yeah.
Like they had their own movement going on where people were like, anything on this label, I'm buying it. And, grunge was big at the time. Metallica was big at the time. And I think Pantera was starting to get big.
Yeah.
So it was like they were looking for more metal bands. And then here's this label that looks like they have a sort of similar culture to what's going on with Sub Pop, where they've got this, the label has a following, which is pretty rare.
Yeah.
That a record label has a following like that. So yeah, I ended up answering the ad after my friend badgered me for a few weeks. And I had already met the guys in Cathedral before. I was a big fan, and they'd already done a tour of the U.S. I think it was called the Campaign for Musical Destruction, with like Brutal Truth, Carcass, and Napalm. And so it was kind of a shoo-in, like I called their manager first I talked to their A&R guy at Columbia, and after bullshitting with him for a few minutes, he passed me through to the manager, and next thing you know, I was in Cathedral, and which was amazing because I thought they were great. I thought the record that they had just recorded was brilliant. I thought we were going to be very successful. And then we went on the road and through a series of follies with Columbia Records and, picking the wrong tours and things like that. It just didn't go the way that anyone thought it was going to go. And at the end of the day, the band was dropped, and I was, faced with the decision of moving to England or quitting the band. And I think we all sort of realized that it just really didn't make sense at the time. Lee was still living in Coventry. If he had been living in London at the time, it probably would have been something I considered, but it was he kind of lived in a place that was very much like Flint, Michigan, where I was from, which was his hometown. It was probably part of the reason why him and I relate to each other so much, is from similar place. Like Coventry is sort of like a smaller version of Birmingham, which is very much like the British Detroit. It just didn't work out, but I remained really good friends with those guys. And so years later, when they were about to call it a day and they were not happy with their personnel completely, they asked me to come back.
Now, also in the 90s, but you ended up not doing it until kind of recently. You guys were also working on a side project band with members of Cathedral, which was Septic Tank, which was more in line with the Discharge Punk that you guys were all into. That kind of the forefather of what became the extreme hardcore and punk and grindcore stuff, right?
Yeah, that was just something we were doing for fun when we were rehearsing. We'd at the time, it actually started when Barry Stern from Trouble was playing drums for us, because he was such a pro that we hired him to play 4 gigs, and he flew over to England to jam with us, and he already knew all the songs. So we had 4 days of rehearsal booked, and on day 1, 2 hours in, Barry had nailed everything. So well, what are we going to do with the rest of our time? So we started writing, kind of Discharge Punk type songs, which is something we were all into. So just for fun, we started doing that, and then we started recording the songs as we were writing them, and we were like, cool, man, we're going to do something with this. And then Gaz, the guitarist, he lost the tape, or it wasn't recording or something, so we lost all the songs. So we talked about doing that again for years, and it took until when I rejoined Cathedral and we actually recorded. I went over to record the bass parts for the last Cathedral album, and I finished a day early, so we had a whole day of studio time free. So Gomez, the guy that was engineering the record, is a drummer. So he got behind the kit, his assistant was manning the board, and we just fucking started banging out songs. And that first 7-inch that came out, that 4-song 7-inch, we wrote and recorded that in one day.
Wow. And then basically after Cathedral kind of wrapped, you guys actually went back and recorded the full length. Was it just, that was always the idea eventually to do it?
Yeah.
At what point did you end up being because you're the U.S. label rep for Rise Above, right?
Oh. Yeah, I mean, that's a bit more of a glorified title. But basically, Rise Above was being distributed through Metal Blade, and it just was time for... They did a great job. I think I can speak for Lee and myself. We're both huge, boosters of Brian Slagle. He's, a legend in the industry. Done so much for heavy metal, heavy music in general over the last 40 years, But it was just time for Rise Above to sort of stand on its own and not be underneath another label in America. It's always been on its own in the UK and in Europe. But in America, it was sort of time for Rise Above to have a little bit more of a independent presence. There was talk at one point of opening an office and all this shit over here, but it just really didn't make sense. So, it's distributed and marketed by Red in America. And actually, most of the marketing and promo is done just by Rise Above. I basically have the phone and the address and all that kind of stuff, and I've done some A&R stuff and helped out a lot of the bands, but by no means can I take any credit for, what Rise Above is. Yeah, that's all Lee.
And speaking of Lee, we're going to end this section, just ask a question. So, with Cathedral, Lee wrote a couple songs that are based on the Blind Dead series. Was Lee Dorian also a big fan of like cult and exploitation films just like you were?
Oh, yeah. Basically, the Blind Dead thing came up when we were demoing the third Cathedral album in Chicago. And I had a membership with, Video Wasteland. Mm-hmm. They do a convention in Cleveland. Well, Ken Kish, who runs Video Wasteland, he, way before Netflix, let's say, Ken used to do Video Wasteland mail order rentals. And you basically joined, you got a membership with Ken, and he would send you 3 VHS tapes in a box. And he'd send them to you, watch them, record them, of course, and then put them back in the box, tape it shut, put the return label on, send it back to you with your want list, and you'd put like your top 3 and then some alternatives, and he'd send you whatever he had in stock at the time. So it was like a fucking mail order rental with video cassettes. So like Gaz was just like obsessed. He was like, we were just churning and burning through these cassettes. And one of the movies we rented was Night of the Seagulls. And we had written this riff, like I wrote the main riff to that, the really fucking lumbering, heavy opening riff of Night of the Seagulls. And so when we had a wall, we were just writing right on the wall, and that's how Witchfinder General, we watched that one as well. So we were just coming up with working titles for these songs, and we were just writing them on the wall. And so the Night of the Seagulls originally was just Blind Dead, and we just wrote Blind Dead on the wall. And Matthew Hopkins, we just wrote Hopkins on the wall. And it was like, we were just coming up with working titles for these songs, and some of them stuck. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a little break, and we'll be right back after these messages.
This is not an advertisement for a new movie. This is a warning. If you are squeamish, if you have nightmares, if you have a weak heart, before you experience Reanimator, think very carefully. H.P. Lovecraft's classic tale of horror, Reanimator. It will scare you to pieces. This motion picture contains scenes of horror that may be considered too intense for anyone under the age of 18. Remember, you've been warned.
Welcome back. So we're talking to Scott Carlson of the band Repulsion, Cathedral, Septic Tank, and Death Breath. And something that a lot of people might not be aware of, but you were big in the Laserdisc VHS bootleg market back in the 80s, 90s.
Well, I don't know about big. I mean, I never was like, selling mail order like Midnight Video or
Chaz Ballin.
Or Chaz, or Sean Lewis, who had Blackest Heart Video. But I did trade a lot with Sean back in the day. Traded a lot of tapes with Sean Lewis. You guys might be familiar with him.
He does Ron Cotton, and he does Ebion Comics right now as well.
Yeah, he used to have this great amazing fanzine that was like horror films and porn and trash called Blackest Heart. It was a totally mean-spirited and fucked up fanzine, and it was brilliant. But and I used to trade tapes with him. So I traded a lot of tapes, horror movie tapes, which worked a lot like the whole tape trading thing with music. It was basically just people who were really enthusiastic about films, trying to find all the movies that they wanted to see that you just couldn't find anywhere else. And there was a guy named Mark Sawickas, who from the band Impetigo, who had the most amazing Laserdisc collection, which he bought a lot of from Don May of Elite Entertainment. Don May used to be from Elite Entertainment. Now he's Synapse Films. But Don worked at a Laserdisc store in southern Illinois, when he was in college, and Mark lived in Southern Illinois, and he would go to that store and buy like Don was ordering all the imports, so like he got all this crazy shit, all the Argentos, all the Fulcis, etc., Demons, Let Sweeping Corpses Lie, all these incredibly rare Japanese laserdiscs, which were letterboxed, which at the time was unheard of in America. Letterbox films just didn't exist on home video. So he had all this stuff, and when he was he was actually moving to Singapore to take a job, so he offered me if I wanted to buy some of this stuff from him. I ended up buying all of it from him, long story short. And so I started making copies of it and selling them at Chiller Theater and shit like that. People were like super into it, you know. And it was really just to support my habit. It was like I wanted to buy more Laserdiscs and more VHS tapes and more posters and etc. So we would just sell some bootlegs, and we would mix it in with like, you know, we'd have bootleg VHS tapes and we'd have legit VHS tapes, which you know, I told you a little bit about earlier. We got them from this guy Barry in Chicago, who was like a doctor who collected VHS tapes, like factory VHS tapes, and he had a fucking warehouse full of them. So we bought tapes from him. We had posters, and you know, my partner back then was the guy that sells movies in the lobby at the Egyptian, so everybody knows him.
Shout out to Brian.
Yeah. So and he's a great business partner, by the way. And yeah, we had a lot of fun, like going to all the conventions. We went to every Chiller Theater, every Fango for years. We did that. We'd go from West Coast to East Coast and everywhere in between at every fucking show selling stuff. And yeah, it was fun. But it was, you know, it just basically was to support the habit.
You know, a lot of people might have missed this because there's a lot of nostalgia for VHS. Like, I definitely bought VHS when I was growing up, and like I definitely borrowed things from like, you know, rental places and taped my own copies. But like, in order to see things that were uncut, letterbox and all that, like you had to buy bootlegs because a lot of them were only on Japanese Laserdisc. However, and I should mention this, a lot of Japanese had a peculiar thing they would, you know, they didn't like. They didn't like pubic hairs, so they had optical censoring. So my first bootleg of Cannibal Holocaust, where like all the cannibals aren't wearing pants, so you see these guys running with just blinding lights shooting out their crotch. I'm like, what the fuck is that?
Yeah. The way to see Cannibal Holocaust back then was to know someone like Ken Kish from Video Wasteland, who had a dupe of the British pre-cert tape. And it wasn't quite as clean quality as the Japanese version, but it was uncut and uncensored. So that was always the way, like Ken always would find these things.
Yeah.
And there were several other films as well that were like, okay, it doesn't look quite as sharp as the Japanese, but it doesn't have all that fogging on it.
I mean, the one big one was always Cannibal Apocalypse, because like there's that weird scene where John Saxon goes down and like bites this underage girl around the crotch area or whatever, and that was always optically censored for like 2 pubes or something like that, because that's how. Watch the movie. The other thing about Japanese Laserdisc, they had burned in subtitles, so they would have the English dub, so you can understand it, but then they would have like Japanese subtitles burned in, and sometimes you would get like Cantonese and Vietnamese, and you would have like 15 different languages going at the same time because they were like just presets on the Laserdisc.
Yeah.
What were some of the big titles you were looking for at the time? Because like people don't understand now what in the days of like boutique labels and Blu-rays and like. Actually, it wasn't until like Anchor Bay where like you could readily get shit that was like really hard to find and get decent copies. Like, what were some of the things you were always looking for and they were always hard to find?
You know, it seemed like at the time, because we didn't have the internet, so all you really knew about was what had been written about in books. So it felt like you could get anything you wanted to if you knew a tape trader, you know? Although there's a lot of films that have been exposed to everyone since VHS, or, you know, since DVD and Blu-ray and all this shit has come along that we didn't know we needed to see, you know. But yeah, I never felt like oh my God, I can't find that movie anywhere. I can't remember a title that was like that. But it was, there were certain things that were like, when they first came out, it was like, I remember, Army of Darkness was a big bootleg for a while. Peter Jackson's Brain Dead, Meet the Feebles.
Yeah.
These were the films that were like, these were the cornerstones of the bootleg market. It was like, because you couldn't see them any other way. Della Morte, Della More, before it got released in America, was huge. Because the first time I saw that movie, I had to buy it from Video Search of Miami, and it was like a shot off the movie theater screen. They somebody bootlegged it in an Italian theater, and then they fucking subtitled it, and that was how I first saw that movie. And then it came out on Japanese Laserdisc, and it was like, oh, look at this, it's nice and crisp, and yeah, it was great. But that sort of more now, it's like now that there's the internet, and every film has sort of been overturned, and every little stone has been overturned, and so now we know there's only a very small handful of films that we can't see, unfortunately.
One of my favorite bootleg VHS that I bought off of Laserdisc was the Claudio Simonetti Horror Project, which was touted as the Goblin Live video, but it was really Claudio Simonetti with like his pre-Demonia band.
Yeah.
And I remember getting it and then getting to the Deep Red rap.
Oh, yeah. Classic.
And I was just like, why the fuck has no one ever talked about it?
I've never watched that. Yeah. I did have Dario Argento's World of Horror, and I believe there was like a follow-up film.
There was another one, like I forget who directed.
Master of Horror?
Yeah, it was Master of Horror.
Yeah, I had both of those on Laserdisc. One was Japanese, and I think there was an American Laserdisc of one of them.
There was a VHS, definitely, of World of Horror that Michele Sobe directed.
I believe that was also on an Image Laserdisc. Dario Argento's World of Horror.
We might have to pull up the Goblin rap before we leave.
Deep red, the color of the blood that's dripping all over the place, and people die, children cry. What's happened to the human race? We've got to stop it, cause the beat just coming on. Let the music flow in your brain and take it, and bring it all over. Deep red, you're dead.
It is pretty amazing, though, that thinking back to those days and trying to see Claudio Simonetti in action, that now people are so spoiled that Goblin, 2 or 3 versions of Goblin tour America 3 or 4 times a year, and you just take it for granted. I mean, Fabio Frizzi was in town recently. I heard 100 people showed up or something at his gig at the Fonda. It's amazing that you can actually see these people perform live. Because
I think Goblin was probably one of the few bands that had CD releases of greatest hits that you would get. But the way when I became obsessed with horror soundtracks, which was always the Italian stuff, was you put your VHS in, you put your RCA cables into your fucking tape deck, and you basically record your own versions of Keith Emerson doing the Inferno theme.
Yeah.
Or you did the end credits of the Beyond and stuff like that. Which nowadays you can get nice MP3s or vinyl represses and stuff, but there's something kind of cool about having yo, listen to this shit.
Yeah.
Listen to the end of Beyond.
I don't know if there's any other good examples, but I remember there was a Suspiria DVD that came with the soundtrack as a double disc.
Yeah. That was the original Anchor Bay release, which came with it was a 3-disc at the time, so it had Suspiria, had the bonus features, and then it had the Goblin CD. Because before then, I think Cinevox had done some reissues in 2000. Because I remember when I used to go to New York and visited a guy we used to be in a band with, Jason Worm. We go there and I'd hit the soundtrack section. I would Goblin record, grabbing that shit. Goblin record, because that was the only way to get it at the time.
Yeah.
Now, you worked a lot of conventions. Was there any crazy stories from back then? Because conventions are different than how they are now. Because back in the day, it was more about buying merch and buying memorabilia, and less about famous people being there to sign autographs.
That was always part of it, but it feels like now people are, for one thing, people just take the movies or the availability of the movies for granted nowadays, because everything is on Blu-ray or you can watch it fucking streaming. I mean, you can go on Amazon and watch. It's unbelievable. You can watch The Oily Maniac in fucking HD.
You can watch Strange Shadows in an Empty Room on HD.
I mean, it's just fucking insane. Island of the Fishman. Anything you want to see is on fucking Amazon. Some pretty obscure shit, you know? But yeah, it's totally crazy. But so I feel like, people sort of take the movies for granted a little bit these days, and how readily available they all are. So it does seem to be a lot more like, you know, Freddy Krueger worship and shit like that at the conventions. And no one cares anymore, like, at least not at these, what is it called now? I didn't even remember. Monsterpalooza. No one would care if, like, she just passed away, but, you know, if Ilsa, if Diane Thorne showed up, or, you know, Ted Mickles, or Herschel Gordon Lewis. A lot of these people passed away, but these people used to come to the conventions, and Rudy Ray Moore, you know, and people were like fucking stoked, you know. And now, no one cares about. They only care about the more mainstream shit. People are all excited about Rob Zombie movies, and you know, at Chiller Theater, it wasn't about like promoting some new crap horror film. It was about paying respects to the masters of the genre. And nowadays, I mean, you know, it's like fucking people from Twin Peaks and shit sitting around in the lobby of the Burbank fucking Hilton or whatever the fuck it is, like, you know, taking pictures of people for $15 a pop or whatever. And it's not the same thing. And there are some people that are keeping it alive. You know, there's some fucking T-shirt dealers and a couple bootleg dealers that are still, like, you know, sort of keeping the old school vibe alive. And of course you've got these great companies like Severin and Vinegar Syndrome who are actually taking all these films that we've all wanted to see and, like, actually giving them proper treatment, you know, which is really incredible to see.
One convention story, and this is something you told me that I'm going to make you tell, is like there was a very famous in the, I guess, mid-90s when Lucio Fulci, like Fangoria Weekend Horror in New York, actually flew Fulci over for his very first and what would be his last convention because he died pretty close right after it. Mm-hmm. You actually sort of met Fulci at that convention. You want to tell that story?
Yeah, I was with Sean Lewis from Rotten Cotton and Brian, who you guys know. And there were probably a couple other guys there. And we ran into Fulci in the lobby of whatever hotel that convention happened at in New York. We were all like super excited. It was Friday night and the convention was like Saturday, Sunday. And Fulci was totally cranky. And he was bitching about Tony Timponi from Fangoria. What the funny part was, he was like really mad at Tony for supposedly treating him horribly. And like an hour later we ran into Tony. He was like, I just took him out for steak dinner, and like he's been like completely pampered since he arrived here. But he was just, you know, being a prima donna or whatever. But anyway, he got tired of shaking hands before he got to me, so I never got to shake Fulci's hand. He shook Sean Lewis's hand, he shook Brian's hand, and then I stuck my hand out, and he just looked at me and went, bah! Just blew me off completely. So I didn't actually get to shake Fulci's hand, but I did talk to him. But I will say the same weekend we got to hang out in the bar with John Saxon and, you know, tons of cool people at those things. You know, Paul Naschy was at one of them, and it was amazing. Argento, all these people used to show up at these things. It was like seeing a unicorn, you know.
Now, was Fulci wearing the hunting cap from Cat on the Brain?
No. But he looked even worse. I mean, he looked like... It was really weird because Fulci died. He was only 69 or 68 when he died, something like that. And he looked like he was like 100. He had like 4 teeth. And like, he just looked old. Like, he clearly just didn't take care of himself, you know. As the other night I watched For the Apocalypse. And I was watching the interview with... Thomas Milian and Fabio Testi that's on the old Anchor Bay DVD. Thomas Milian says, poor Lucio. After talking about what a difficult prick he was to work with, you know. But yeah, he was cranky, for sure, you know.
I remember when that convention actually happened, there was a snowstorm on the East Coast. Because,
like a legendary blizzard, yeah.
Because, like, that was at the age where it's like, I'm going to lie to my parents, I'm going to come with this elaborate lie so I can go with my friends to go up there and just snowstorm.
You wouldn't have got away with that one.
Mm-hmm. No.
You'd have missed a couple days of school.
Yeah.
Because on Sunday night, that was, Saturday, Sunday convention. On Sunday night, Sunday day, it just started snowing really fucking hard. And it was like, oh shit. It was fucking just coming down hard. And Motorhead was supposed to play at the Limelight that night. And half the people at the convention were like, fuck yeah, Motorhead tonight. And then the Motorhead show got canceled. We're like, oh, this is fucking serious now. Motorhead just canceled. We were kind of stuck at the hotel, and like Brian and I were kind of going stir crazy at the hotel. And we were like, we got to get the fuck out of here. So we grabbed all of our shit, put it in a cab. And I don't know how we got a cab, but we got the guy to drive us across town and drop us off at Trent Hogge's house. And we stayed at his house and just holed up and drank in his apartment that night.
That's when Trent was like just kind of coming up, and he was in those early Troma movies, like what was it, Terra Firma, the first movie?
Terra Firma, Romeo and Juliet, all that. Yeah.
So we're going to end this section because we were talking about movies and screenings, and I'm just going to ask you and put you on the spot. What's your favorite Cinematic Void screening you've been to thus far?
There's so many good ones, but I gotta say, this is probably going to be a boring choice for some people, but the Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue screening.
You and I have kind of bonded over giallos because we're both huge fans. Like,
yeah.
What about the genre was something that attracted you to it?
I mean, what's not to like? I mean, I consider myself sort of like a immoral. By most people's standards, I'm a fairly immoral person. I'm a complete atheist. I really have a completely, I don't care. I have no judgment of people's devious instincts, unless they're harming someone else. I mean, that's why I kind of like relate to Satanism, like I'm not a Satanist, but I totally agree with the philosophy of like the Anton LaVey theory of Satanism. I think that people should do whatever the fuck they want, and I think that they should indulge in it. I think that people should explore their own possibilities in every way. And that is one of the most brilliant things about giallo films is the supposedly lurid behavior, the cruelty, the beautiful women. It's like a 1968 Playboy magazine wrapped around a Alfred Hitchcock storyline with the music of like a psychedelic Italian rock band, and add into that like crazy fucking instruments of death, everything from wooden dildos to fucking hat pins to you name it. What hasn't been used to kill people in a giallo? It's like they're just I get so excited when I talk about these films. They're so just completely insane on just about every level, and that's what I love about them. Like there's you strip nude for your killer, Black Belly of the Tarantula, of course all the masters, Lenzi, Martino, Fulci, Argento. They're all brilliant. Nowadays it's easy because we have seen all of these films. It's easy to take someone like Dario Argento for granted, but the guy made some of the most brilliant, beautiful films I've ever seen.
I mean, honestly, from 69 to 87, he did no wrong outside of like 5 Days in Milan.
The other night I watched the Blu-ray of Phenomena, and I kind of was taken aback at how fucking great that movie is. I hadn't seen that in a long time, and it's almost like not even a giallo. It's kind of a loose.
it has enough giallo elements.
Yeah.
It's not like Suspiria where like, and this is another thing I'm always going to say, kids, Suspiria and Inferno aren't giallos. They're supernatural movies.
Yeah, and Phenomena's kind of the same, you know.
But there's definitely a Black Glove Killer. Yeah. There's definitely the guy in like the fedora and raincoat and that kind of thing. Where that isn't really in Inferno Suspiria, but like I understand what you're saying because like I feel like Argento during that period couldn't do any wrong because he was just on another level, and I feel like those early like from '69 when he was doing his early giallos, when Martino was doing his early giallos, and Fulci was, and Lenzi, like none of those guys were just basically playing t-ball. It's just like hitting home run after home run, and like. That's my favorite period of giallo. I know Argento gets all the love, but like as someone that programs a lot of giallos and stuff, and I obviously do January giallo, I always try to shine light on like the films and the filmmakers who don't necessarily get the Argento love that should. That's why I do things like What Have They Done to Your Daughters and
brilliant movie
and Blade in the Dark and things like that because like people don't really see them because they think giallo is always the Argento style, but like there's a great variety of them. They can run from being a cult to like being gothic horror, and like they just run the gambit of like subgenres, but they always go back to like these murder mysteries that are like Edgar Wallace and Agatha Christie.
Yeah, I just recently saw one that like is really not even a giallo, but it's very in the giallo style, which is by a guy who did make giallos. What's his name? Luigi Bazzoni, who did Fifth Chord.
Fifth Chord.
I saw this film called Footprints on the Moon,
and
that's a fucking cool movie, and it's not really a giallo, but everything about it feels like a giallo, except for the fact that there really isn't like a killer. You know, so to speak.
The thing I like about some of those, and like, because we've had a debate over All the Colors in the Dark, because you don't feel really it's a giallo, and like.
Well, I mean, it could be, or it falls into that category, like you're saying, of like
it's adjacent.
It doesn't have all of the tropes of a giallo, so to speak.
As I look for giallos, I'm still trying to find 35mm prints in order to screen, and it's getting harder and harder because like there's only a lot of them did U.S. releases, but like. Not a lot of distributors kept them. Yeah. Like, I'm just going to state here, bucket list. If you got to print a black-bellied tarantula, give me a call.
Shit.
I think someone probably has a print, but because it was an MGM title, and then Warner Brothers bought MGM from a certain point on, and that would be one of the titles. It might be a Warner's if there's a print, but then Blue Underground put it at the DVD, and, you know, that's the other thing is a lot of those get convoluted releases.
Yeah.
And that's another thing I love about them because they might be widely available, but they're harder to see in like film formats because like, you know, this year when I did January Giallo, I showed 2 Italian language prints because like the U.S. print of operas cut the shit. Blade in the Dark may have had a U.S. print, but like no one ever fucking saw it.
Yeah.
And it's just like, that's the one thing when I look at people's film print lists and stuff, that's always the first thing I look for is like what giallos are there and what can I fucking show that hasn't been shown.
Well, for the sake of simplicity, you know, we can lump all these movies that sort of fall outside of the strict giallo definition, like Footprints or All the Colors of the Dark or Phenomena, Suspiria. They have the spirit and they have the vibe of subversive behavior and danger, whatever else you want to say about these films. So they're all giallos, as far as I'm concerned.
On that note, we're going to take a little break, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Night, a time for quiet, a time for evil. Behind the door, through the window, a time for terror. A terror that leaves a tiny clue, a pattern, a blood. Repeated again and again and again. Don't make a move. How do you forget? How do you hide from a horror that pierces your most secret moments? How do you escape a death that comes in the night like some monstrous ancient ritual? MGM presents The Black Belly of the Tarantula, a gothic tale of terror and death.
Welcome back. It's time for where we discuss what we've been currently reading, watching, listening. Since you're the guest, Scott, we're going to start with you.
Which one?
Whatever one you want to start with.
Well, a reading. I'm actually reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which I'm embarrassed to say I have never read before. So I thought about it, and I was like, I need to read this. So I did some research online and found the definitive version of the book and bought it, and I'm reading it right now, and it's brilliant.
I didn't realize there were alternate versions of it.
Yeah, the version that I have, I have to break it out to show it to you, but it's reconstructed from Shelley's notes and from Byron's notes and Shelley's original draft, and it's pretty cool. There's a lot of notes in there, and
I didn't realize Mary Shelley was getting the Orson Welles treatment at this point.
Yeah. So that's what I'm reading. Watching. I just watched High Plains Drifter on Saturday, and since it was the first time I'd seen it since my childhood, when it's probably went over my head, I realized that there's actually a supernatural element to that film, which I never was privy to before. And I have all kinds of stuff that I need to watch in my queue, like the brand new Kino Lorber release of Cannibal Apocalypse and Pray for the Wildcats, which was probably the greatest TV film ever made, with Andy Griffith as a completely deranged, hippie-hating psychopath. And listening, I've been listening to Judas Priest in my car and at home.
Particular record?
Point of Entry, which is like a more oddball one, you know, but it was like the record when I was a kid that made me go, what's going on with Judas Priest? They seem to be, are they selling out? I'm not sure, but you know, back then it was like, just seemed more like experimental for them to try and write commercial music. I didn't think of it as like a cynical ploy where they were trying to like sell billions of records. So I listened to that record a few times this weekend and like realized like there's a section of it that's really great, and then there's some filler tracks, you know. When I'm at home, I'm usually listening to soundtracks or like soul records or whatever.
Nice.
All right, I'm gonna throw it over to you, Nick.
All right, I've been reading just more of Last Exit to Brooklyn. Still not terribly far into it. Also been just reading tons of Alan Moore Swamp Thing stuff. And then I've been watching, I'm still going through The Good Place, but I'm about halfway through the 4th season, and I don't want it to end so much because I just love it so much. It's just the perfect television show that I've started watching Marvel movies for like no fucking reason. And I'm maybe like 8 to 10 Marvel movies in, and as much as I love comic books, I don't love these movies, and I'm not here to talk shit about them, but I don't love it. I'm gonna watch them 60 hours worth. I don't give a fuck. I'll watch them, but I'm still just not very interested. I don't know. Anyway, also, I don't know. We saw Griselda on Friday. Jim and I both went, and it was amazing. So I've still been listening to a ton of the Griselda stuff. Also, they brought out Boldy James and Alchemist. Been listening to tons of the Boldy James Alchemist record. And I also just found a bunch of the Knowledge Meek Mill mixtapes. So that's what I've been listening to. How about you, Jim?
I haven't been reading shit. I did pull out Choosing Death for a little bit just to prep for this, and then I realized, like, why am I pulling this out when, like, I talk to you on the regular anyway? Watching, I haven't been watching much stuff. I just got Hot Dog the movie on Blu-ray delivered today, so that's going to be in my queue. I also got House by the Cemetery remaster New York Ripper that I've been sitting still in the plastic because I'm a dickhead who's buying things that I've already seen. They're like, I can't wait to watch these remasters, and they're just sitting there. So,
like the Cannibal Apocalypse disc I just bought. Like, seen that movie. Do I need to see it again? Probably not, but I'm going to watch it again.
I'm going to break the plastic sometime this week and actually watch them. Listening wise, I've been on a weird path. Like, we definitely saw Griselda, so I've been listening to like a lot of that stuff and all the Benny the Butcher and Conway and West Side Gun, like solo stuff. I also been listening to a lot of Ghostface Killer because I missed his 2019 record. And then I threw on randomly today. I listened to Repulsion Horrified because, again, prep for this. Still holds up. Thank you, Scott. And I also listened to a lot of just the random Spaz tracks. If you don't know who Spaz is, Spaz was what they considered West Coast power violence type thing, fast hardcore. They were one of the bands that kind of got me into like, oh, they're one of those bands that talked about Hong Kong movies, cult movies, smoking crack for no apparent reason, and like they basically were into a lot of stuff I was into outside of smoking crack, but I kind of threw it on. It's been a good nostalgia kick, so that's what I've been listening to.
I still don't know what power violence is, by the way.
No one knows what power violence is. If you go by it, it's just the fucking 4 or 5 bands that Man's Bastard shouts out on that one song. But on that note, we're going to wrap up the Cinematic Void podcast. I want to thank our guest for this week, Scott Carlson.
Thank you, guys.
And we're going to be back. We're going to be recording something next week with our friend Josh Miller from Friday Night Fright, so stay tuned for that. Otherwise, we'll see you in the void.
Thanks.